Here, I can move this up.
So, you get a coat. Remember, a coat. Yeah.
I was gonna bring my business cards, but didn't, because I always forget.
Have it back in there. These things. Just reach, can all be reached. Well.
Okay.
That's the way that always goes, so.
Well, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'd like to thank everybody coming today. We got to start off as a duo and ended up as a trio. So we'll let them sort out speaking, what they speak about. In the meantime, I'll introduce them real quick. We've got Patrick Lendrum. He's the science manager for the World Wildlife Fund, their Northern Great Plains program, where he leads the projects that answer questions addressing losses and of native grasslands and the impacts on wildlife and human communities. I think I told Patrick, but I think I forgot to tell the rest of you that I condensed your bio slightly.
Okay.
So we could get all these. So if you notice something's missing, that was me. Patrick earned his MS and PhD examining land use changes, the impacts to wildlife, and methods of sustainable development. He's worked across the western U.S. in a variety of habitats, spanning coastal rainforest to prairie grasslands with species ranging from insects to bison, or to grizzly bears, probably bison too, but in the meantime. With him also, we have Alexis Bonogofsky, who is the program manager for the World Wildlife Fund, their Sustainable Ranching Initiative, where she oversees efforts to sustainably manage native grasslands in the Northern Great Plains. She's also a sheep rancher who lives and works on her family's place along the Yellowstone River near Billings. Before coming to WWF, she managed the new agrarian program, providing apprenticeships for Montana ranchers. And prior to that, she managed the Tribal Lands Partnership Program for 11 years, working with intertribal organizations on energy efficiency projects and advancement of tribal programs focusing on wildlife and cultural issues. And last but certainly not least, we have Aaron Blossom, who coordinates the WWF's Sustainable Ranching Initiative activities within Montana, including building and managing relationships with local ranchers, rural communities, agencies, and NGOs. He works to develop and pursue sustainable management goals that facilitate landscape scale conservation across grassland habitats, wildlife populations, and rural communities. He's originally from South Dakota, has a background in plant community ecology and habitat restoration, and has worked with agricultural producers in Montana for about the last 10 years. So with that, again, thank you for everybody for coming, and I'll turn it over to Alexis. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayes. Appreciate you guys all coming today. Like Hayes said, I'm Alexis Bonogofsky. I'm originally from Billings, Montana, and my background is actually in international development and international studies is what I went to college for and my master's degree. I decided that after I went through all of that, that I actually wanted to stay and work in Montana. So I moved back home. My family has a ranch just south of Billings, and I do raise sheep. And so I think a lot of people are surprised that World Wildlife Fund has a program in the Northern Great Plains. It's not necessarily expected because people associate World Wildlife Fund with sort of international wildlife conservation. But as you'll hear in this presentation, you'll learn about why World Wildlife Fund is working in the Northern Great Plains and the programs that we have that help protect the intact grasslands that we have here that are very special and important. So the way we have our presentation framed, I'm going to move through that since that's introductions. The way our presentation is framed is Patrick is going to start by setting the stage. So let's talk about the Northern Great Plains. Why is World Wildlife here? What are the threats to the intact grassland ecosystem that we have? Then Aaron and I are going to cover what programs World Wildlife Fund has that helps address these problems that we're seeing. And then we're going to talk about the ecological monitoring that we're doing so that we can actually track change over time. And so those are the three big topics we're going to talk about today. We're definitely happy to take questions at the end of the presentation, so write them down as you have them. We'd love this to be an interactive conversation. So I'm going to turn it over to Patrick so he can sort of set the stage for us.
Hey, thank you, Alexis. So yeah, why is the panda in the prairie? We're talking about the Northern Great Plains. You see the map there. A lot of us familiar with this area, hopefully. It is our backyard. It is one of the least protected and most at-risk biomes on the planet. The Northern Great Plains in particular is one of the last, 4 or so remaining large intact temperate grasslands. And it's being lost at an alarming rate. But so maybe, I think it was about 20 years ago, WWF did sort of a global analysis looking at where these threatened landscapes are, and this one floated to the top. So we've had a program here since 2002. Hopefully, again, no surprise to anybody here, but grasslands are incredibly valuable. They provide huge numbers of biodiversity, both plants, animals, and that's being lost at an alarming rate. The figure on the left there is showing, this was from a few years ago, looking at grassland bird declines going back to 1970. And if you can see that sort of beigeish color at the top there, that's the grassland birds showing the largest decline of any gild. Birds are a great example, but you can look across a lot of taxa and see the same decline across the Great Plains. Grasslands also store vast amounts of carbon, so great climate mitigation. We'll call it a tool, but a landscape. Right? And as those grasslands are turned over and plowed, that carbon is released, contributing to global climate change. So maintaining intact grasslands is of critical importance and a big part of what we do. It's also a natural flood control. We can see plenty of examples where grasslands have been tilled and floods come through during these big abnormal rain events, which are now becoming normal rain events. But where there's intact grasslands, you get infiltration, reduces flood runoff. So incredibly important for that too. And then of course the people of the region, you can't forget that, right? That's what maintains this region as it is, provides livelihoods, produces food, not just for the US, but for the globe. And is part of what our value as WWF is hoping to promote and protect. And so I mentioned conversion briefly. Part of what WWF does is track grassland loss from Canada down through Mexico across the Great Plains. And so this is looking at rates of grassland conversion, annual expansion. And so on the bar chart there, the blue is looking across the Great Plains, so the entire geography in red there. When we say Great Plains, we're really talking central Great Plains grasslands. And then the orange line is for the northern Great Plains, so that upper boundary in our backyard here. And while you can see those numbers are declining, that's great, that's what we're after. We're still looking at over 1 million acres of grasslands being converted every year across the Great Plains, and around 400,000 acres a year in the northern Great Plains alone. So while there's great work happening, great stewardship, restoration, the levels of conversion are vastly outpacing that. And when we talk about grassland loss, it's not just to the plow, to row crop conversion. There's also woody encroachment happening. And we had some conversations about this earlier today, but that's really an increasing threat that's more and more on people's radars too. Especially in the southern Great Plains, you see a lot of that, but we are seeing it up in the northern Great Plains as well. And so WWF is part of a collaborative called the Central Grasslands Roadmap. If you're not familiar with it, I suggest throwing it in Google and pulling it up. It's, I think, spanning 700 million acres from north to south, like you can see in the boundary there. But then it's also entities across everybody that works in the region. So landowners, native nations, companies, academics, NGOs, the whole alphabet soup is involved. And what we see here in purple is what we're considering lost grasslands. So either plowed or encroached by woody material, mostly non-native trees, a lot of eastern red cedar moving into this area, But then we're also having woody encroachment in this area by trees that maybe should be here, but haven't been managed or maintained to stay out of the grasslands. And so the purple is anything that is already lost. The yellow is what's vulnerable, so meaning at high risk for conversion to those two threats. And then the green is what is considered large core intact grasslands. So when we say this is a relatively intact ecosystem, you can see, maybe I can wiggle the mouse here, there we go. Our region up here, large green area, Sandhills green area, a little bit down in Colorado and New Mexico. And that's really what's left of the grasslands. So we want to maintain that and grow that area and make sure that yellow color doesn't turn purple and can turn back to green. So some of the big threats and the reasons that we're working across this whole region. A little mess here, maybe. No. And then the other piece, like I mentioned too, when we talk about climate change, this is a global issue. It's not just a US issue, not just a Northern Great Plains issue. There's some work done a few years ago looking at grasslands at large and trying to understand where the biggest impact could happen to benefit grasslands from a climate perspective. And the first one circled there in red is just showing avoiding grassland conversion. If we can halt conversion, it can have the largest positive impact for climate change mitigation. Two other ones I want to draw your attention to on here are grazing optimization and grassland restoration. And those are pieces that we'll talk about too moving forward as part of what WWF is involved in. And so our Northern Great Plains program, to sum it up, we have three big overarching goals. One is stop grassland conversion in the Northern Great Plains, particularly sort of along the spine and what we call the focal counties of it, the most intact, most biodiverse pieces of the NGP. We also want to increase bison herds where they are accepted and desired. So primarily working with Native nations in a couple national parks to increase bison populations. And then same with black-footed ferrets, the most endangered mammal in North America, hoping to increase those numbers where they are wanted as well. This leads us to really three different work streams. Hopefully I've kind of touched on these, but one is protecting and maintaining grasslands, first and foremost. Without the grasslands, the rest can't be here. And then we also want to scale up sustainable ranching, economic-based, grass-based livelihoods, make sure that is a viable and growing opportunity as well, and then restoring wildlife. So that's really what brought WWF to the region, why we've been here for so long, and why we think collaborating and working in this region is so important. If I didn't explain to anybody why the grasslands are awesome, we could have questions afterwards. With that, I will turn it over to Alexis.
All right, so under the Northern Great Plains office that is based out of Bozeman, we have the Connect team, which works with Native nations, and then we have the Sustainable Ranching team, which is what I lead. We work under three main buckets, so protection of grasslands, management of grasslands, and then restoration of grasslands. So our primary goal here is to preserve and protect the high quality grasslands that do exist in the Northern Great Plains. But we care about wildlife and we care about communities. And so all of our work is embedded in the communities in the Northern Great Plains because we know that long-term durable conservation has to live in communities. And so we are very aware that all of the work we do needs to be prioritizing people as well as wildlife. And so a lot of the work that we do is to support ranchers in their efforts to manage the land that they have under their control, but also to help build the capacity in the local organizations that exist in these communities. And I'll talk about those organizations here in a little bit. So we want to improve grazing systems. We want to restore marginal cropland back to native grasses, and we want to find economic incentives to help protect grasslands and work on conservation. So the goal, these are our big number goals, is that we have 1 million Northern Great Plains acres protected under 10-year no conversion agreements by 2025. Those same acres to be sustainably managed through grazing systems, and then restore about 34,000 acres of marginal cropland back to grass. There's a lot of places in the Great Plains that have been plowed for cropland that probably shouldn't have been. And a lot of those ranchers are looking to bring those areas back to grass, which is what I'm going to talk about here in a second. So currently, this is through the end of 2022, so our numbers have actually increased in the last 2 months since these numbers were compiled. We have about 543,000 acres under the protected category, so no conversion agreements and reseeded. The same, a little bit less of those acres sustainably managed through grazing management systems, and then about a little over 13,000 acres reseeded back to native grasses. I'm going to talk about our reseeding program. You can imagine reseeding native species back to the land in a semi-arid environment experiencing drought is very challenging, and it's very expensive. It's one of those measures that we look at as sort of looking at where the core grasslands are and trying to target our efforts in places that we're actually either can connect habitat ecosystems or would really have high value in the reseeding. So the goal is to reseed 34,000 acres. We provide technical assistance to people, so how to replant native species back, and then we pay for the native seed mix, which can be is obviously more expensive than if you were just purchasing tame grasses or introduced grasses. So the ranch agrees to not convert those grasslands for 10 years. We approve the seed mix. We help them with how to do it. They provide post-seeding reporting to us, and then some of those ranches are actually getting soil monitoring. So we do like a pre-monitoring trip before it's reseeded, and then we monitor after. And Patrick can talk about that a little bit more later. This is really popular among a lot of the ranchers that we work with, and so we work directly with ranchers to do this. They just apply with us, and then we work with them directly through this. So it's pretty straightforward. This is a map of where our acres are actually being, like currently where we have the most acres reseeded. So that one's the most straightforward program. And then the second program we have is called Ranch Systems and Viability Planning, RSVP. And this program started in 2020, I think. It's been a long couple of years. Our goal is to enroll 1 million acres in this program by 2025. It is an enrollment-based program, but also a network. So if a ranch chooses to enroll with our program, we provide technical assistance for ranch infrastructure changes, for grazing management, anything that the ranch is interested in improving. We have the resources to help them figure out what to do. We provide trainings and educational scholarships to attend grazing schools, ranching for profit, livestock handling clinics. So anything that a rancher is interested in and improving that relates to grazing management, we can help them get there. We provide a cost share program to help implement these ranch changes. So that means we provide up to $40,000 per ranch and 50% of the project costs. We provide monitoring so that we can do soil health monitoring, grassland bird monitoring, and other ecological indicators so that we can do a baseline when they enroll with us, and then we provide the monitoring over time. And then we facilitate the larger network so that ranchers can connect and learn from each other in the program. The ranch agrees to no conversion of grasslands for 10 years. We see that as short-term protection. But as we know, if there's a good grazing system and it's working for the ranch, the chances of them plowing up grass for crops is a lot lower. So as we invest in these ranches, we believe that longer term, the risk of conversion will become less and less. They agree to develop a grazing management plan if they don't have one, and we hope interacting with us over time that the intention is that their grazing will improve year by year. They agree to the monitoring program, and then they agree to complete training. And so we really hope that our program is super flexible for each rancher, so we meet ranchers where they're at. And then our staff over the Northern Great Plains works with them to develop a plan for their ranch. And I'll show you here, I think the next slide. So as of this month, we have 71 ranches covering 662,000 acres. And then I think the next slide might be a map. This shows the counties that we're working in. So the darker counties are where we have the most ranches enrolled in the program. And then you can see the stars, and those are our partners. So we think it's extremely important to invest in the communities that we work in. And so our partners are local rancher-led organizations. So we have Rancher Stewardship Alliance, Win It ACES, Eastern Montana Regenerative Agriculture, American Bird Conservancy, Sandhills Task Force, Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition, and South Dakota State University BFSD program. So we actually fund them to hire people to provide the technical assistance to the ranchers that are in their communities. And this is a map of where the ranches that we work with are located. And it's broken down by year. So the lighter color was the ranches that we just enrolled in 2023. The red is 2022 and the blue is 2021. So we have a good breakdown, diversity of ranches in each state, and you can see it would overlap with a lot of the intact grasslands that Patrick was talking about earlier. The bottom chart shows our cost share program in terms of the amount of money that we've contributed to ranch infrastructure projects. So our money comes from a variety of sources. We are constantly fundraising for this program. We are funded by the USDA, we are funded by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, we are funded by numerous corporations that are interested in supply chain resiliency. And so that, as we grow, we're constantly increasing the number of people that are supporting this program. I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to talk about another cool project we're doing on our ranches. And he also is running our cost share program. And I think that's a program that a lot of people don't quite understand, like what does cost share mean? So he's going to cover a little bit about what that looks like when a ranch approaches us for funding. So.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Alexis. Oh, mouse.
You can just hit the arrow.
Great. So just to talk about one of the cost share practices, and then the cost share slides are after this one.
We don't have any cost
Oh,
share. It's just...
I'll just talk about that for a quick second. So circling back to this concept of RSVP as a network, I think that's a really good lead into talking about cost share. So cost share, a lot of groups would have a program that they call cost share, where you're providing assistance for somebody to do some infrastructural development, water, pipeline, fencing on their property, and just helping them achieve their management goals by building infrastructure, by reducing the cost of entry for them to put some of those on their ranch so they could, rotate more frequently, put water more equitably around their pastures to actually do the management they want to do. I think our approach is a little bit different in that it's everything that we do circles back to the goals of the individual ranchers and the network at the heart of RSVP. So unlike, we wouldn't necessarily be coming to ranchers and saying, we have a goal to do this migration practice for pronghorn or these practices for beaver that I'll talk about in a second. Although those layer really well into activities that are good, for building resiliency on a ranch. Instead, we're always circling back to what the goals of the ranch are and building our cost share program around that. And which makes it a little bit easier to then go to all these different funders like Alexis was talking about, the USDA, the Fish and Wildlife Foundation, other foundations and small grants, because we have projects that we know are going to succeed because we have already developed those relationships and project goals with the individual ranches. So we do a lot of cost share for stock water developments, for cross fencing, for management. That's definitely the biggest part of the cost share program. But we're also exploring, because we have some flexibility, other sort of less conventional projects with ranchers. And so the best examples would probably be, and those are also typically things that some of the bigger agencies aren't quite funding yet, like virtual fencing, which we could get into in questions if you want. We have some ranches that are trialing that, moving animals without internal fences with geolocated collars, and then the MESIC restoration work, which is building off the concept of beaver dam analogs and restoring sort of the function that beavers provided by stopping water and increasing floodplain connectivity. But the angle on the ranches that we work with that want to do this work is that those ecological functions of restoring floodplain connectivity is also really good if you're trying to grow grass to feed livestock to sell beef from. And so this is really marrying one of those practices that is, in theory, good for livestock if we can prove that it is building resiliency in soil moisture, forage production, as well as wildlife. These areas, especially in the arid parts of eastern Montana, western South Dakota, Nebraska, are biodiversity hotspots. I mean, in a dry year, they're the only place that's still green. Again, good for wildlife, good for grazing. It's like the statistic is 80% in some places of biodiversity is found in these areas. The concept here is to scale this work up dramatically. It's supposed to be affordable. You're just sourcing materials from the property itself, woody material, soil, building these structures repeatedly throughout sections of stream that are either straightened or incised to slow down water, increase the elevation of the stream bed, spread water out, and ideally improve the habitat and vegetation complexity. And so we did this on 6 ranches last year in a new partnership with Montana Conservation Corps, where instead of building a crew that just does work in like the national forest trails, we've worked with them to create some crews that are doing this work their entire season. And this year in 2023, there's actually 2 of these crews coming online, working on some ranches that we have partnerships with, as well as ranches that other folks have partnerships with. And then speaking to some of the conversations we had this morning about, what are the actual outcomes of this work? Because at the end of the day, it's really hard to talk anybody, ranchers included, into doing something like this if the outcomes are uncertain or there's risk involved. And so we're reducing the risk by just making it easy for people to do this through our cost share program. And we're trying to explore what some of the outcomes might be. This is just an example. We've been working with the Yale High Plains Stewardship Initiative, some internships that they have to develop a rapid assessment tool where in the watersheds where we do this, you could click where we're putting a beaver dam, it would automatically create upstream area of interest, and then look at changes in diversity and soil moisture indexes before and after installation, and then over time as time proceeds. So this is not a before and after of that, it's before and after of the drought that we've had recently. So on the left, everything's green because that was a normal precip year, and then the drought starting in 2020 on the right. But in theory, if these structures are working, what we would see on the right in maybe 2030, if a drought occurs, is that those areas of interest are still ecologically functioning, they're still green. So kind of pairing some of our implementation with monitoring outcomes and hopefully increasing adoption of these practices at scale. And with that, I hand it back to Patrick. Squeeze by.
Yeah. Great. Well, we could easily spend the rest of the talk talking about any of those pieces of the project that Alexis and Aaron mentioned. Given the audience and hopefully your interest, we're going to focus on the monitoring aspect of that, the ecological monitoring in particular. And so I'll run through a little bit of what that entails. Alexis already gave this overview, but you can see two big parts of this, of what the ranch provides, or what WWF provides, and what the ranch agrees to involve this ecological monitoring. So a critical piece of this work to make sure that these changes on the ground are having the beneficial impact that everybody is hoping for. So stepping back a couple years, first thing we did was really think, so what is ecological monitoring on rangelands, in working lands? What are indicators? What should we be measuring? So we got together with a few different groups, some NGOs, some academics, some landowner groups, and really did a synthesis looking at what's out there in the literature, what type of ecological monitoring programs are available. We found 21 different publicly available ecological monitoring frameworks, we'll call them. And we basically just took those, went through all of them to see what indicators these 21 different networks were recommending. And there were 180 indicators. So first thing we said is we're not going to go on every ranch and measure 180 things. That's ridiculous. And so we stepped back and we tried to condense that and figure out, well, what are the important ones? How are they connected? And we came up with this mess. Still not easy to figure out, but we started breaking it apart and bucketing in it. And so in those different colors, circle and triangle, you have social and economic well-being. So the people part at the top. Climate indicators, so a lot of carbon, plant aspects in there, water on the right, and then the biodiversity, the animal and plant biodiversity as well. And we drew lines between them, which are connected. They're all connected. And so you pull any little straw of that and you start tugging on all the other ones. So then we looked at, well, what are outcomes versus what are pieces that connect those outcomes? And really tried to dig down into this. And in the end, we took those 180 indicators and we came up with 20 indicators that we thought were manageable. This includes all of those buckets and a few from each of those. And we thought really gave a decent representation of what's doable, what helps us understand how change can be managed or monitored and managed. And so we're just going to focus on the ecological ones. But this is the list. And again, we kept those same sort of themes, so breaking it out into soil, water, vegetation, and biodiversity. And then what are the metrics for those? And so you can read the list there too, but really soil organic carbon, soil stability or erosion, bulk density or soil compaction, ground cover, so what is on there, the litter, the bare ground, and then water measures, so water infiltration, Aaron just talked about the riparian channels. So while not a lot of ranches might have those, if they are, they're still incredibly important to measure and monitor. And then what the vegetation is. So cover an abundance of native and non-native plant species. Forage productivity, really tying in that economic piece. And then the biodiversity. For this, we're looking at grassland bird diversity and abundance. Really good ecological indicator of rangeland health by and large. Again, we were talking about microbial diversity earlier, which is another good one. But birds, people like birds, you see them, and they really do tie in this ecosystem as well. So these are what we measure on, would you say, 660,000 acres across the northern Great Plains. I don't think I have a slide in here, but the way we look at this, we'll start here, is that as a ranch enrolls in RSVP in this project, they get a baseline monitoring. So we go out on the ranch, look at the current condition, measure all of those, and then we follow up that as well. Right now we're doing 2- and 3-year repeats of this project. So the ranch enrolls, we skip a year, allow for time for changing management if that's what's desired, go back and do repeat surveys the next following few years. And on every one of these ranches, we stratify the ranch. So we break it down by soil type, aspect, slope, vegetation type. And then we put a random sample of 20 points across that stratification. That 20 points is based a little bit on economics. This is not cheap to monitor at this scale. And then also on what we think gives us a robust estimate of what those indicators are and how many we need to measure to see change over time. So the different colors, some of these are vegetation and soil carbon, really those stars. And then what's the 5-sided shape? Hexagon? The blue one and the green triangle, pentagon, thank you. Those are water infiltration and forage productivity, again, stratified by that sample. And so getting into a little bit of the actual methods themselves, and I'm breezing through this a little bit quick. I know this is recorded so you can revisit, but hoping we have time for questions if any come up as well. So for the soil sampling, what we're using right now is a Giddings probe or a hydraulic soil sampler. This allows us to get out to every one of those 20 points and take a meter soil core. A lot of the time, 30 centimeters, 15 centimeters is what people go after. Part of what we're interested in is long-term management change, what you can see below that 30 centimeter, and then also soil carbon stocks. So what's been built over decades, centuries, potentially, depending on these areas. And really trying to get at that deep soil carbon. This gets back to what I mentioned in the beginning too, with land use change and conversion, understanding what carbon is being stored in the soils, then we have a better idea of what carbon is being released to the atmosphere when grasslands are converted. This is an expensive part of the program and gives us great baseline, but then for follow-up, we do 30 centimeters, and then maybe at a 5-year interval, we'll go back and do meter depths again to see if we see changes. We're just starting to get results back. And so what do you do when you have these numbers in hand? Well, one approach that we're taking, and sorry, it's a lot going on, hard to see here, but is we're comparing what we're seeing in the field. So that's what says lab. It should actually say ranch maybe at those different depth increments. So 0 to 30 centimeters, 30 to 50, 50 to 100, and then that entire 100 or meter depth core. And then comparing that to what might be the best available information out there on soil carbon or soil health, being the Surgo database, NRCS and USDA puts this out. And so we have sort of an expected reference and then an actual measurement on the ground and seeing how those compare. Our first year we had 16 ranches, so that's what this is showing a subset of. We're getting back another 38 ranches times 20 samples, so 720 samples, 60 samples, which will help us build this out. What's really interesting about this, though, what we're seeing so far, is that the soil carbon in the ranches is generally higher than what's expected based on the Surgo database. So why this is, we're still trying to understand. Has it just been a legacy of good land use and land management? Are Surgo estimates off? Have these lands been intact for just that long that the soil carbon is building? A lot to unpack there, but hopefully helpful information. And then as grazing management changes, we can see particularly in that top 15 or 30 centimeters, how that soil carbon might respond to grazing management. We focus a lot on soil carbon for climate, but also soil is the building block of life, and everything above that depends on it. So when we talk forage quality, forage productivity, plant species, water infiltration, really this is a strong indicator of all of that. The next piece is the water infiltration. This has become increasingly of interest, particularly given the drought conditions that we've been having the last few years and maybe seeing down the road. And so for this, what we use currently is a dual head infiltrometer, a little fancier than the dual ring that maybe some of you have used or put out in the field, but basically same idea. Go out, saturate the soil, and then see how long it takes for water to move in there. We're hoping this will be one of the faster responding indicators to changes in grazing management and plant species on the land. And so we do that at those subset of points like I mentioned as well. One downside of this approach is it takes a lot of time. So the fields that are out in the crew, or the crews that are out in the field, however that works, they're sitting around for a while waiting for this as opposed to those dual rings that are a lot quicker. but we feel it's more of a robust measure that we can get good baselines. And then as ranchers or others want to get involved, they can use other techniques and monitor more frequently along time. Looking at some of these results just briefly here. So the different shades of blue, again, the infiltration measure, that lighter blue, I guess we'll say, is what we saw in the field. And then the darker blue is what NRCS predicts for that site based on ecological site descriptions. You can see a few of those are pretty close, sort of the ones under the 2 inches per hour flow. And then a few that are sort of off the charts for what was measured in the ground or at the site on the ranch. And so another question is, well, why is this different? What can we learn from these sites that have good infiltration? Can that be replicated? Again, this isn't water runoff, this is actual infiltration. And so we're starting to look at plant species at those different sites. Are they native species? Are they non-native? Are they perennial? Are they annual? And what teases out there? And so for 3 and 4, if you look down there with the higher infiltration rates, you see blue grommet, needlegrass, and moss. Whereas the upper ones, you see crested wheatgrass as the first one, and cheatgrass in that system too. So maybe there's something going on here. And then as changes in management happen, restoration happens, we'll repeat these and see if that changes based on what's happening on the ground. At each of those 20 sites too, the stars on that map, we do the vegetation monitoring as well. There's different monitoring techniques, transects, hoops, quadrants. When we did that analysis that I mentioned, sort of the review of the indicators, every framework had a different way to monitor rangelands too. Not incredibly helpful, but something else that we're working on is consolidating methods. What we're using is this hoop, gives us an idea of what is in the area right around where we're taking those other measurements to make sure we have a good paired design. Again, we look at species composition, bare ground, soil litter, native, non-native, and then biomass clippings for forage productivity that can be dried and estimated after the fact. We don't need to run through this, but just showing sort of what it is, right? As when we're out there, what we're seeing, percent cover, type, is it a forb, is it a grass, is it a moss? What's the percent of bare ground? And then again, how do those correlate back to the biomass? So in some drought years, do we see more biomass with native species? In good moisture years, do we see more biomass with tame or planted species? Again, perennial or annual, and really trying to understand how this monitoring can relate back to grazing management and be informative for the landowner and the ecological health and function of the land. The last piece to touch on here for the monitoring is the grassland bird surveys. So again, we follow that same sort of framework, ranch and rolls, baseline grassland bird surveys take place in mid-May through early June. Since we're working from Nebraska all the way to Montana, there's a little bit of a gradient there, and we try to capture really that peak time when you can hear and see birds. We follow standard protocols for the most part so that everything that we're collecting across these hundreds of thousands of acres can be integrated into some of the other bird monitoring programs. So 6-minute surveys, at peak singing time, 10 points per ranch. One thing that's a little bit different about what we do as opposed to some of the other bird surveys out there is we're matching these points with those vegetation surveys so that we can really know on the ground what that vegetation is, how those changes are, and is there a correlation to the birds. And then while the surveyors are at the site, they also do kind of a general assessment. So has it been grazed? What's the average height? And things that we can help to understand grazing management and bird diversity and abundance at that time of survey. Again, this is just showing a 10-point subset of the 20 points on the ranch. And so still trying to capture a random sample that's representative of the landscape and of where grazing management might be taking place, or changes in grazing management, excuse me, with repeat surveys down the road. We've been seeing birds. It's good. Let's see. We produce bird survey reports and monitoring reports that we then give back to the rancher. This is a snippet from one of those, but really shows the ranchers what's on their ranch, what's on other ranches, what's in different states in the area. Are there key birds of interest, like the chestnut-collared longspur that we're seeing on their ranch, a little bit of natural history about that. Really a good learning tools, things a lot of people are engaged in, and a good management tool too. I think we're seeing decent numbers out there. This past season, there was over 110 species detected across that range. And then this is really how those numbers break down. Again, a piece that we share out is what birds are by what region. So not going to run through all of these, but just sort of sharing how we share this information back with producers to make sure it's meaningful with them. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up and open it up for any questions.
Open that up for folks that have questions on me.
While you're thinking of good questions, I'll also turn it over and say, anything you'd add to what we glossed over there?
Maybe real quick, maybe Alexis or on the educational side, maybe talk a little bit how you educate or work with education programs with that ag community, and kind of what your metrics are, what you target, and
Sure.
and just kind of how you assess that.
Yeah, so the educational component to RSVP is very driven by the rancher interest. And so I'll start with the monitoring, is that we want our monitoring to matter to the rancher. So I think there's sometimes in this work, we can have this like monitoring for monitoring's sake, where like institutions and like scientists are like have the data and do a bunch of stuff with it, and then it doesn't actually like make it to the people who can utilize it. And so I think for our program, what we want is we want this data to matter to land managers. And so one of the big things that we're working on is how do we take all of these, everything we're collecting, and make it useful. And so we are going to do work with our ranchers to, like, we have these reports that we're creating, and one of our other scientists, Adam, is really spending a lot of time creating reports that that are useful. And so it's not just a bunch of like stuff that, like, I'm a non-scientist, and so it's really good for like when Patrick and Adam are talking to me, I'm like, I don't get what you just said. Like, I don't understand this. We need to, you know. And so we have that on our team where we're like, how do we take the science and make it useful? In terms of the other educational work that we do, we have a series, and Hayes actually presented about dung beetles for us, but we have it's called Ranching with Wildlife series, where we pick a species like dung beetles or prairie dogs or beaver, and we have a webinar about that specific species and how ranchers can adapt management to promote that species, or in the case of prairie dogs, it's like, here's the biology, here's how some ranchers are coexisting with prairie dogs. So we have an educational series that helps people learn about, you know, different wildlife species and how you can manage to increase them if you want, or just manage them in general. We also think it's extremely important to have education around financial viability, because if these ranches are changing hands, if these ranches are coming out of ranching families and into absentee land ownership or into cropping systems, that is a big problem. And so we want to make sure that ranches can stay in the families. And so providing tuition to go to Ranching for Profit, which is a school that helps ranchers learn how to do enterprise accounting and change maybe how they're looking at their business. So we actually pay for ranchers to go to that. And then in terms of grazing schools, we want to connect ranchers throughout the Great Plains with each other so that they are learning from what is working in one place might work in another place, and really connecting in that way. So it's like weaving a network throughout the Northern Great Plains of learning. And so the educational component, I think, is one of the, I think, more attractive pieces to the program, because we're emphasizing that you know, because that is how long-term change will happen, is ranchers learning from each other. And so, and we're investing heavily in that piece. Did that
Yeah,
help?
no, thank you.
Okay.
You get on all the
Yeah.
stuff. Appreciate it. Yeah, I think you're right on with usable information, and every
Yeah.
cohort finds same data presented a different way, more usable.
Right.
Useful, applicable around than just one stop. So,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, and I think that one of the hardest things, especially with monitoring, is that there's so many variables. You know, drought, management changes. Like, what if a rancher doesn't have time that year to move the cows as much as they hoped because of like a illness in the family, or like, or a fence fails, or like all of these different things that impact people's management on their land. And I think another thing that I think about a lot is labor on ranches. You know, it's, if we want people to move their cows a lot, who's going to be moving the cows? You know, like if you're just one person and like a Bill Milton who moves his cows every single day, is that realistic for most people? So we try to kind of look at this, be really realistic about that we're working with a lot of ranches and a lot of different ecosystems with a lot of different family situations and a lot of different financial situations. And so not one ranch is going to look the same as another ranch. And so we can't say, you know, we want to be super flexible and adaptive with how we're working with people.
So right along that line, you're asking for a 10-year program.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if in the 4th year the family decides to sell the ranch?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I mean, we are looking at our program as long-term relationships. And so we ask them before they agree to partner with us, do you have any intention in the next 10 years is there an intention of ownership change? Or we want them to be fairly certain that in 10 years they're going to maintain management. If something happens and they have to sell due to whatever circumstance, then that is, you know, sort of something that a risk we're willing to take, because we feel like we're not going to move into the sort of legal system of like, if something happens and you can't fulfill this part of the agreement, you know, we're not going to take people to court over, you know, like anything like that. So we see this as a really long-term partnership of like, we want people to want to work with World Wildlife Fund, and we hope that that stuff doesn't happen, and it hasn't happened, but if it did, you know, we would know about it and, you know, adapt. So
I think an important piece too is like, these aren't conservation easements.
yeah.
These aren't legally binding. It's an agreement for the program and
Mm-hmm.
nothing more.
I noticed in your monitoring, there's not satellite-based data monitoring, or maybe it just wasn't listed. Such as from the rangeland analysis platform. Is that something that you incorporate into your monitoring, or is there resistance from ranchers? Or you could potentially use the data you're collecting on the ground to ground truth that data too? Curious about that.
Yeah, great question. We do a lot of remote sensing work. We do weather monitoring. We use RAP for biomass to validate some of these. The rangeland analysis platform, RAP. We look at NDVI. So we do incorporate that a lot, but yeah, great call out. I was just focusing on the ranch level indicators and then how those all scale up. We're also open to use this information to better understand what intact grasslands across the Great Plains look like. So sort of a gradient of intactness. We can't say that they're native or not if they're not plowed. So using this to help validate remote sensing for that is another use too. Yeah, thank you. Good question.
Climate is such a big driver of systems, and probably even more so than farming systems. I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you guys are thinking about that. I heard Aaron say that 2019 was a normal year. I would argue that that was one of the least normal years for a while. I'm thinking of 40-acre cattail patch out of Broadview, Montana in 2019 was supposed to be a week. So it was pretty wet. Right. It's such a big driver of random systems. What job do you handle that? How would you think about it, I guess?
Yeah, I can speak to a little for the monitoring. The risk piece, I'll leave that to them. But for the monitoring, again, with these long-term data sets that are out there, we are looking at precipitation patterns, temperature patterns for each ranch and creating sort of a weather diagram that we include in these reports. And we'll factor that into what that year's monitoring showed as well. So it's not just a one-off and they're done. So it's built into the monitoring piece. Beyond that, though, yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of people that we work with in the last 3 years have destocked upwards of 70% of their livestock, and so, and have lean, you know, and maybe have lean on the property or equipment or something like that. That is part of what the infrastructural assistance is designed for, is to help them weather some of that while building some infrastructure that might help them scale their herd down, but still with fewer inputs, and maybe, you know, through the network effect, like getting connected to a different certification scheme of some kind, maximize their net profits while we're in a drought. I don't know that there's a super good response to how do we help people with risk other than doing the best we can.
Yeah.
What is their time horizon? Like how far in advance do they think about this? In the experience?
Interesting.
I think everyone's really different. I mean, the spectrum of ranchers that we work with range from people who have been doing adaptive rotational grazing for 40 years to people who have just put in their first cross fence this year, you know, from that kind of like season-wide big pasture grazing. And so I think what we know is that we're not prescriptive in anything that we do. We're like outcome based. And so when making decisions, I think one thing that what we hope our program encourages is longer term thinking and longer term decision making. But that's something you know, it's definitely a process with everyone. And so I think everyone's a little bit different.
Thinking about climate change, just from the perspective of grassland conversion. Right, climate change is going to hit ranchers hard in terms of drought, but it's also, I would expect, going to further marginal what's already marginal cultural land. So, what do you think we're going to be seeing in 20 years with respect to grassland conversion or abandonment?
Yeah, great place for projections to come in. I could speak to what we've seen is that colorful map that I put up there with the green cores. We also looked at conversion risk and some of the areas in the Northern Great Plains that 5 years ago we were saying were no risk of conversion, we're seeing being tilled over now. And part of that is economics, but part of that is climate change. And particularly as crops further south either get displaced, like if wheat down in Kansas is getting displaced by soy, then we're seeing more wheat being plowed up or planted in Montana. So it's looking across that whole gradient of sort of crop drift, precip patterns, longer growing seasons. So while some lands will be marginal, or maybe what we would have called sort of no-go zones then become marginal, which is actually better for growing than what they were, while others are going from being high quality productive soils to low quality productive soils. So it's definitely a dance on the landscape, and how it plays out long term. Great question.
And I think what enters in there too a little bit is the risk of land changing hands, because of the people that we work with at these 650,000 acres, and just in ranching communities in general, it seems like more ranchers want to do more ranching and less farming. So the risk of conversion comes when the ranch is not viable anymore. And so that gets back to helping the ranch be profitable and viable. And the communities where many of the members ranch or work for ranches, or sell things to ranchers are also viable.
Yeah, but if you have like a ranch in Circle that is next to a farm and that goes out of that family's hands, like, and then the neighbor farmer buys it and, it's right next to a cropped field, so it makes it easier to crop that land, and so looking at those places too. We work with a ranch that's surrounded by farms around Circle, and, if he had to sell it, most likely it would be turn into a cropped system, so looking at those issues too, I think, yeah, it's really complicated. Yeah. The economics behind that, and how do we address that on we also have a federal policy team that looks at farm bill incentives and all of that, and we get input from the ranchers we work with on those, so.
Yeah, the farm bill policy is what start making changes. That's when all that conversion happens.
Yeah.
When we work with one group that's trying to restore it, we look across the valley and they're ripping.
Mhm.
And they're both federal agencies getting paid by the same group.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You mentioned you're not prescriptive to set these programs up. Then works with a producer to design their grazing management.
Yeah, we have technical assistance people and we have grazing consultants on contract. Yeah, that we pay to consult with the rancher. Yeah. And we even see some of the ranches we work with, like I said, they're just putting in a first cross fence to make one pasture smaller, and they're going to just start which is a success to us, just starting down the road of, breaking things up a little bit. And so it might be a more simple grazing plan, and then others might be doing a way more intensive sort of grazing plan. And that'll be interesting to look at the monitoring data and go what we're seeing, just kind of because we know certain management things have been happening on one place, and look at the differences between those ranches in similar systems.
Well, and I think from a monitoring standpoint, I mean, I'm no expert on this stuff, but I've been looking at grazing and soil carbon and infiltration, and there's lots of times you can't measure anything after 10 years of a change, and sometimes even longer.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you can't even measure the difference in half of that stuff between an exposure and a very intensive grazing system. So we've been talking a lot about this on the carbon credit game, and if you can't measure it, you don't know if it even happened or not. This whole thing is, we've been doing this for 75 years.
Yep.
Trying to figure it out. We haven't figured it out, so I hope you guys figure it out.
Oh, that's fair. And a lot of what we're seeing applied to the northern Great Plains is what people have learned in the southeast, where they have whole different precip and plant communities and can see change quick. And it's not directly applicable. So
Yeah, I mean, when you get frost heaving, you get infiltration rates that change from year to year, all based on soil type, not based on, or texture, not based on grazing practices.
Mm-hmm.
yep, absolutely.
I don't know how you're gonna do that.
Yeah.
Correlated and probably way too simplistic for you folks. We can't measure differences. Improvement, let's put it that way. We can't measure improvement. Is it ecologically, ornithologically acceptable if there is no change? That it at least hasn't degraded? Would you consider that a successful program?
Yeah, so our model, I'd say, is meeting ranchers where they are, and then maintenance or improvement depending on where they're at. So if a ranch is in the condition it needs to be, they want to be, and that's where it stays and it's not getting worse, that's a good thing. I'd also say part of the way this is designed is that we're monitoring all these other aspects in addition to soil carbon. So maybe some of those you do see change in, even if the soil carbon you don't. And is there a better indicator to grazing management that you do see that change in? So we're making sure that's a piece of it, but not the sole purpose of it.
Well, I mean, just bird diversity
Mhm.
improves, but nothing else does.
Mhm.
That's a win.
Yeah.
Grassland's still up, right?
Yeah.
Right, the white side of
Yep.
To your question about prescription, I can tell you that there have been some really interesting conversations when we will show up and a ranch will say, well, what do you actually want me to do to be in this program? And we just turn that question back to them, back to this whole idea of like the goals should be ranch based. And of course, like they're used to people showing up with, and there are all, of course, there's a ton of expertise in the landscape of people that can show someone how to do something differently and maybe better if that's what differently can lead to. But it's a lot more powerful if they ask, it seems like if they ask like their own questions and then go to a ranch for profit and come back and want to do things sort of on their own, creating their own ideas and goals. And I would say that's just back to the idea of the network and ranch-based goals.
Yeah, and it's nice to have, we have a cohort of ranches that is excited to work with us. And so that means as projects come up and like different, like the wetland restoration has been really amazing because we just kind of know, okay, these ranches are interested in this, in the beaver dam analogs or wetland restoration. And then we can go to them and we have immediate project areas that we can do other conservation work with. And you know, we don't advertise the program in any way that's like, we don't beg people to join it. In fact, unless they're excited to work with us, we're like, you know, think of this as a long-term partnership with a team who's here to help you meet your goals and things will come up in the future. And it's been ranch, like people hear about it from another ranch and then we'll get calls like, tell me about this program. And then we just tell them, and then maybe they'll sign up right there. Maybe they'll sign up a year later. And it's been a really kind of, you know, it is a network and we're looking to keep it because we think that the real change will come when like, you know, this starts to happen in communities just you know, from word of mouth and they see, you know, neighbors see other practice changes and are like, what are you doing here? I'd like to do that. And then if, you know, the ranch becomes more financially viable because of these changes, like increased forage quality or, you know, anything like that, then we're protecting the grasslands. So.
Any other questions? Again, thank you, Alexis,
Yeah.
Aaron, Patrick, thank you. We'll feed them lunch now. Thanks for everybody for coming, appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all for taking the time.
I'm hungry.
Should I hit stop record?
No, I didn't. Thank you, that was great.
Yeah.
Got to check out. So, Chris. Questions. So, anyway, I'll get emails and I'll send it all to you guys.
Okay.
Should I stop the recording
Yep.
or
Yep.
close it?
So,
Or to touch anything?
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So are you seeing any changes in those things?
We've